The executioner's rope was already slick with her father's blood when Captain Miller looked into my eyes and whispered that I was next. They stole my youth, locked me away for 10 brutal years in a stone fortress, and buried my mother in a nameless ditch while they drank fine bourbon from crystal glasses. Comment where you're watching from if you believe that a broken soul, returning from the dead with nothing but a rusty blade and a heart full of ice, can tear down an entire empire of corrupt lawmen. The autumn wind of 1784 howled through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys of Boston, carrying the bitter stench of burning whale oil, rotting timber, and cheap corn whiskey. The city had changed, morphing into a sprawling, lawless nest of greed where the weak were crushed beneath the heavy boots of men who wore polished silver badges but possessed the hearts of alley rats. I walked down the broken cobblestones, the collar of my heavy, threadbare woolen coat pulled high against the biting Atlantic gale, every step sending a dry, hollow ache straight up my spine. My hands, calloused and scarred from 10 long years of breaking stone in the colony's harshest prison, were shoved deep into my pockets, my fingers curled tightly around the cold iron handle of a heavy canvas sea bag draped over my shoulder. Inside that bag weren't clothes or keepsacks, but heavy iron gear shafts and solid steel spikes I had salvaged from my father's old ironworks. They called me Clara, a name the authorities had officially scratched out of the town ledgers a decade ago, marking me down as a deceased convict who had succumbed to jailhouse fever. They wanted me dead. They needed me to be a ghost, because a ghost couldn't speak, a ghost couldn't point a finger, and most importantly, a ghost couldn't demand an accounting for the blood that had been spilled. I stopped outside the fogged-up windows of the Golden Anchor, a low-ceilinged taverna down by the shipping docks where the air inside was thick with the suffocating reek of stale ale, unwashed wool, and cheap tobacco smoke. Through the grime-streaked glass, I saw her, a young, pale waitress named Annie, barely old enough to remember the war, was trembling violently behind the stained oak bar, her eyes wide with animal terror. 3 local ruffians, dressed in expensive buckskin coats and fine linen shirts, the unmistakable uniform of the gang that controlled the illegal spirit trade in the harbor, had her completely cornered. The largest of them, a brutal, thick-necked dock fighter they called the Ox, had his beefy, scarred hand twisted tightly in her long brown hair, forcing her face down toward the sticky, alcohol-soaked wood of the counter. He laughed, a low, wet roar that echoed off the low-ceiling beams, ordering her to lick up a puddle of spilled rum right off the filthy surface while his snickering lackeys cheered him on, demanding she apologize for her slow, miserable service. In the dark corners of the taproom, a few honest shipwrights and local laborers sat with their heads buried low over their bowls of mutton stew, completely paralyzing themselves with fear, desperately trying not to draw the attention of the thugs. The heavy oak door creaked on its rusted hinges as I stepped inside, the sudden draft of freezing air causing the tallow candles to flicker wildly. I didn't say a word, didn't make an announcement, just walked with slow, deliberate steps toward an empty table near the frostbitten window, setting my heavy sea bag down onto the floorboards with a dull, metallic thud that cut straight through the tavern's ambient noise. Annie let out another soft, broken sob, and the Ox instantly slammed his open palm against the back of her head, rattling her teeth. He yelled for her to shut her mouth and keep working, his arrogant voice bouncing off the walls. But as he turned his head, he caught sight of me sitting perfectly still by the glass, my eyes fixed on the gray street outside where the gale was chasing shreds of old parchment across the mud. He noticed my heavy, unblinking gaze and a nasty, crooked grin spread across his bloated face. He let go of Annie's hair, wiping his sticky hand on his trousers, and began to swagger toward my table in a slow, cocky stroll, his 2 sycophants trailing close behind him like hungry hounds anticipating a fresh piece of meat to tear apart. He kicked a vacant chair out of the way with his muddy boot and sat down directly across from me, leaning forward until I could smell the sour rum on his breath. He spat directly onto my empty pewter plate, his small, rat-like eyes gleaming with malice as he asked what a ragged old hag like me was staring at. I slowly turned my gaze away from the window, locking my steel-gray eyes onto his face, showing absolutely no fear, no anger, just the cold, detached calculations of a soldier marking a target. The ox let out a loud, mocking laugh, turning back toward his two lackeys who were standing right behind his chair, soaking in every bit of the entertainment. He reached across the table with an arrogant smirk, snatched the pewter salt cellar, and began to methodically tip it over, dumping a thick white mountain of salt straight into my mug of weak cider. He pushed the mug toward me with a rough shove, causing the murky liquid to splash across the scarred wood, and told me to drink it down on his account, bragging that he was feeling like a generous soul today. Way back in the farthest, darkest corner of the tavern sat Magistrate Bradley, a local crown officer who was supposed to represent the law in this district. A half-empty bottle of expensive French brandy stood on the table before him, and he was casually picking his teeth with a small sliver of wood, staring intently at the water-stained plaster ceiling as if he were completely alone in the room. I looked across the smoky air, locking my eyes onto his pristine blue colonial uniform, his polished brass buttons, and his fine leather belt. I called out to him, my voice flat and steady, telling him that there was a disturbance of the peace right in front of his face. Bradley didn't even flinch. He just let out a lazy, condescending chuckle, adjusted his powdered wig, and drawled that he didn't see any disorder at all, only a few fine local boys enjoying their well-earned leisure time. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on his brandy bottle, and added that if any wandering vagrants didn't like the local customs, the heavy iron gates of the colony's penal colony in the hills were always unlocked for the ungrateful. Hearing the explicit backing of the law, the ox grew entirely emboldened, his posture swelling with absolute arrogance as he realized he had total immunity in this room. He leaned across the table, his thick, scarred fingers reaching out to grab me roughly by the chin, sneering that I clearly didn't comprehend who he was. He barked that he was the law in these docks. He was the master of this entire quarter, and that I was nothing but a useless piece of aging flesh wrapped in a ragged coat. He pulled his heavy right hand back, balling it into a massive fist to backhand me across the face. But before his arm could even begin its forward swing, my fingers closed around his thick wrist. The movement was so blindingly fast, so utterly unexpected, that nobody in the dim room even had time to blink. I twisted his arm downward with a violent, precise wrench, and a sickening, loud crack echoed through the tavern, sounding exactly like a dry oak branch snapping under a heavy boot. The ox let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his entire massive frame collapsing instantly to his knees in the filth of the floorboards. His two henchmen froze for a fraction of a second, their faces turning pale before they furiously reached into their buckskin coats, pulling out heavy iron knuckle dusters and long, wicked hunting blades that gleamed dully in the candlelight. I didn't even bother to stand up from my wooden chair. I kept my iron grip locked onto the ox's shattered wrist, forcing his heavy head flat against the table surface, right next to the wet puddle where he had spat just moments before. I leaned over him, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silent room like a razor blade slicing through silk, telling the two shaking pups before me that they had made a fatal mistake. I told them they looked at my gray hair and my old clothes and decided I was something they could trample into the mud, that their fine leather coats and cheap dock swagger made them wolves. But the truth was they were just garbage that had crawled into the corners while the true master of the house was away. The ox was sobbing now, his face pressed into the dirt, screaming for his men to cut my throat, but I pressed my knee down into his shoulder blade, forcing his mouth directly into his own filth, telling him to eat every bit of the disrespect he loved to hand out. The tall, thin ruffian they called the Pike lunged at me from the left, his hunting knife coming down in a vicious, arc-like slash meant to split my skull. Without even turning my head to look at him, I swung my heavy canvas sea bag upward with my free hand, utilizing the momentum of the heavy iron gear shafts resting inside. The impact was devastating. The solid iron pieces smashed directly into a jaw with a sickening crunch that echoed off the timber walls, sending him crashing backward into a row of unoccupied tables, splintering the wood into kindling as he collapsed into an unconscious heap. Magistrate Bradley choked on his brandy, his eyes bulging out of his head as his hand flew to the leather holster at his hip, desperately trying to unbuckle his flintlock pistol. I didn't even turn around, just threw a cold warning over my shoulder, telling the Crown officer that if his hand moved another inch, I would ensure he joined his boys for dinner on the floor. A suffocating, dead silence fell over the tavern, so thick and heavy that you could hear the steady dripping of tallow grease from the iron chandeliers onto the floorboards. I slowly stood up from my chair, my towering frame casting a massive, ominous shadow across the dim taproom, looking like a terrifying specter that had stepped straight out of the colony's darkest history. My face remained perfectly calm, completely devoid of rage or excitement, bearing only the icy, mathematical focus of a judge who had come to carry out an execution that had been delayed for far too long. The ox was whimpering on the floor, trying to wipe the slick red blood from his mouth with his trembling fingers, gasping out a ragged breath as he asked if I had any idea whose men I was touching. I stepped forward, my heavy boot coming down with crushing force onto his broken fingers, making the bones grind together as I told him that he was absolutely nobody. I whispered into his ear that he was just a piece of filth I forgot to sweep away 10 years ago when the king's men hauled me out of this very harbor in iron chains, and that I had finally returned to Boston to finish the cleaning. I reached down, grabbed the mug of salted cider, and slowly, methodically poured the cold, sticky liquid directly over the back of his head, letting it soak into his hair and run down his neck into the dirt. That was the signal, the moment the old rules of the harbor died, and the terrifying realization began to settle into the room that no amount of bribes, no corrupt magistrates, and no gang of dock thugs could save them from a woman who had conquered hell just to look them in the eyes. I grabbed the strap of my sea bag, slung it over my bruised shoulder, and walked past the paralyzed patrons, leaving the broken ruffians bleeding in the dark. As I stepped out onto the tavern porch, the icy harbor air hit my face, and I pulled out a short, rough pipe, striking a flint to light the bitter tobacco as I stared into the fog. The city had turned into a gray, decaying wasteland over the last decade. Where vibrant merchant stalls once stood, there were now only the rotting hulls of abandoned sloops and rows of illegal gambling dens. The honest folk walked with their heads buried deep in their wool collars, their eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow, because in the year 1784, the old laws were dead, the new nation was struggling to breathe, and the rats were feasting on the remains. I pulled the heavy canvas strap tighter against my skin, my calloused hands remembering the bite of prison iron, but my heart was burning with a question that would keep the entire harbor awake tonight. Who would be the next to bleed when they realized the true master of Boston had returned? The freezing rain began to turn into a harsh, stinging sleet as I made my way toward the old brick tenements of District 14, my boots sinking into the thick, filthy mire of the unpaved streets. Every corner of my childhood neighborhood had been stripped of its dignity, replaced by the garish signs of new merchant cartels and illegal counting houses that bled the working folk dry. I approached the heavy, three-story building where my family had once occupied a quiet, modest apartment. But as I entered the dim, damp hallway, the familiar smell of wood smoke was gone, replaced by the suffocating reek of cheap molasses, rum, and raw tobacco. I climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, stopping outside apartment number 12, where a massive, reinforced iron plate now hung over the old oak frame, complete with a narrow peep slot. I slammed my fist against the metal 3 times, my strikes sounding like a blacksmith hammer hitting an anvil, until the heavy iron locks clicked open and a bloated, red-eyed face looked out at me through the gap of a security chain. It was Silas Vance, my former neighbor who, a decade ago, was nothing but a sniveling clerk always begging my father for a copper to pay his rent. Now, a thick gold chain rested against his greasy neck, and his silk waistcoat stretched tightly over his fat belly like a sail over a merchant brig. Before he could even open his mouth to ask what I wanted, I threw my weight against the iron plate, tearing the security chain straight out of the wooden frame and sending him crashing backward into the narrow corridor. I stepped inside, slamming the heavy door behind me, and looked around a hallway that had been completely transformed into a high-volume contraband warehouse. Cages of expensive smuggled tea, crates of taxed West Indies rum, and blocks of uncut tobacco were stacked high against the walls, right where my mother's hand-woven tapestries used to hang. Silas scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his fat fingers reaching frantically for a long kitchen carving knife resting on top of a nearby rum barrel. But I stepped forward and leveled my steel-gray gaze onto his face, causing his arm to freeze mid-air. I told him to put the toothpick down, using his old middle name, and watched as his rat-like eyes widened into absolute terror as the recognition finally hit him. He stammered my name, his voice shaking like a leaf, whimpering that it wasn't possible because I was supposed to be serving another 5 years in the colony's deep mines. I walked past him into the kitchen, looking at the mountain of unwashed pewter plates and grease-stained pans, and asked him, without turning around, where my family's belongings were. Silas edged his way toward the far corner of the room, keeping his distance as he nervously adjusted his gold chain, rambling that the times had changed and that the city magistrates had officially auctioned off the property after my conviction. He claimed he had bought the lease fair and square, that all the papers were legal, and that my family's old trunks had been moved to the cellar where a water pipe had burst, forcing him to throw everything into the harbor. I turned around slowly, looking right through his lies, remembering the exact night in 1774 when 3 men had broken into my father's ironworks office while I was totaling the monthly ledger books. One of them was Silas, the second was a young, ambitious crown prosecutor named Vance, and the third wore a black cloth mask over his face. They demanded I hand over the keys to the heavy iron safe containing the gold coins meant for the entire workforce's winter wages, and when I refused, they cracked my skull open with an iron bar. When I finally woke up in the garrison hospital, I found myself under heavy guard, accused of orchestrating the entire robbery myself based on a forged confession Silas had signed and a fraudulent case prosecutor Vance had stitched together in less than a week. The royal court was swift and merciless, sentencing me to 10 years of hard labor, and now, the very man who had shattered my life was standing in my kitchen talking about legal papers and city auctions. I repeated his words back to him, asking what gold he had used to buy my family's home, and watched his face turn the color of sour milk as he realized I knew every detail of their treason. He began to shake, offering me 500 gold sovereigns to just walk away and buy a quiet piece of land in the countryside. But I stepped into his personal space, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. I asked him what the price was for a single year spent in a dark, freezing stone cell where the walls were thick with winter frost, or the price of the day I found out my mother had died in the town poorhouse because they threw her into the street just 4 weeks after my trial. I reached out, my fingers wrapping tightly around his gold neck chain, squeezing it into my fist until the links cut deep into his fat throat, making him choke for air. I told him I hadn't come back to Boston for his dirty sovereigns. I had come back to my home. I was going to ensure that every piece of garbage that had crawled into it was thoroughly incinerated. Silas gasped for air, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple as the heavy gold links cut into his flesh. But before he could lose consciousness entirely, the heavy iron door of the apartment was kicked open with a resounding crash. 2 of his hired watchmen, muscular harbor thugs wearing grease-stained leather vests and carrying heavy oak cudgels, rushed into the hallway, their eyes bulging as they saw their wealthy boss pinned against the wall by a ragged woman. Silas managed to point a trembling, fat finger in my direction, wheezing out a desperate command for them to take me down and cut my throat. The 2 brutes didn't hesitate. They lunged forward, one pulling a heavy lead-weighted kosh from his belt, while the other unsheathed a jagged, rusty boarding pike. I didn't take a single step backward. I simply looked at them with a cold, almost sorrowful pity, asking them if they truly understood who they were risking their wretched lives for. I warned them that this fat swine would sacrifice them to the hangman the very second the high sheriff started asking questions, just like he had sacrificed me a decade ago. The brute with the boarding pike screamed an oath, driving the iron tip straight toward my ribs in a furious, killing thrust. I slipped inside the line of his attack with an effortless, fluid motion that had been drilled into my muscles through 1,000 desperate brawls in the prison yard, where a slow reaction meant a permanent home in the yard's trenches. I caught his wrist with one hand, twisting it sharply until the bone popped, and drove my iron-hard elbow directly into his jaw, shattering his teeth and sending him crashing to the floor like a felled timber. The second thug froze, his cudgel raised mid-air as he tried to comprehend the terrifying speed of the ragged woman before him. But that single second of hesitation was all the time I required. I drove the heel of my heavy leather boot straight into his kneecap, blasting the joint backward with a sickening crunch that made him scream in pure agony before collapsing into the pile of smuggled tea crates. I reached down, plucked the fallen boarding pike from the floor, and balanced the cold iron tip right against Silas's trembling chin, forcing his head back until his skull knocked against the plaster wall. I leaned in close, the reek of his terrified sweat filling my nose, and told him to listen to every single syllable. I told him I knew he was a wealthy merchant lord now. I knew Prosecutor Vance had become the Chief Justice of the entire colony, and I knew their syndicate had completely strangled every honest business from the shipping docks to the State House. But I reminded him that, to me, they were still the same sniveling rats who used to steal tallow candles from the ironworks warehouse when my father wasn't looking. Silas was shaking so violently that his fine silk waistcoat was rustling, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as he asked what I wanted from him. I looked him dead in his rat-like eyes and told him I wanted them to start losing everything they had built on my father's blood, starting with their peace of mind. I ordered him to clean out this apartment by tomorrow morning and to arrange a private meeting between myself and Chief Justice Vance at the old abandoned foundry down by the river. I warned him that if he tried to flee the city or send his hired killers after me again, I would personally begin slicing through his distribution network, starting by burning every single contraband warehouse he owned along the eastern seaboard. Silas looked at his two watchmen groaning in pools of blood on the floorboards, the terrifying realization finally dawning on him that his wealth and political connections meant absolutely nothing against a woman who had walked through the fires of hell and returned to claim what was hers. I grabbed my canvassy bag, but before I stepped through the shattered doorway, I noticed a small, dust-covered silver frame lying face down among a pile of rubbish in the corner. I reached down, picked it up, and wiped the grime away with my sleeve to reveal the fading, beautiful face of my mother. I pressed the cold metal against my chest, feeling a fresh, icy wave of determination lock my joints into place. The stairwell was dead silent as I exited, the terrified neighbors having bolted their wooden doors shut at the first sound of splintering wood. I stepped out into the freezing midnight air, the sleet stinging my skin as the wind began to whip through the dark brick chimneys of Boston. I knew Silas would be running straight to the watch house or sending a rider to Vance's mansion within the hour, and I knew a full-scale manhunt would be unleashed across the harbor by dawn. But as I walked toward the shadows of the old shipping yards, a dark, dangerous smile touched my lips, because a beast is always easiest to track when it panics and starts to run. The black waters of the Charles River slapped violently against the rotting timbers of the abandoned limestone wharf, the sound swallowed by the deep, rhythmic thrum of a heavy gale rolling in from the Atlantic. Sleet had turned to a dense, clinging snow that blanketed the skeleton of the old industrial colony in a deceptive shroud of white, masking the jagged craters and rusted machinery of the outer limits. I sat inside the freezing hollow of a collapsed brick kiln at the edge of the quarry, the harsh smell of whale oil and black powder rising from the components of the heavy flintlock pistol resting on my knees. Beside me lay the iron-bound lockbox I had hauled from the ruins of the archive house, its lid dented but the seals holding fast against the dampness. I didn't need to check the ledger inside again. Its contents were etched into my mind in letters of fire. The exact dates, the cargo manifests of the stolen iron, and the signature of Chief Justice Vance authorizing my permanent disappearance. Out on the main road, the low, distant rumble of iron-tired carriage wheels signaled their arrival right on time, the yellow glow of their oil lanterns slicing through the swirling squall like the eyes of hunting wolves. 3 dark coaches descended into the belly of the pit, their horses kicking up frozen mud as they formed a tight, imposing semicircle around the technical pond, their leather curtains drawn tight to conceal the armed guards within. Chief Justice Vance stepped down from the lead carriage, his pristine scarlet judicial robes contrasting sharply with the black mud, his powdered wig dusted with snow as he leaned heavily on a gold-headed cane. Behind him stood Silas, looking smaller now, his fat hands tucked into a beaver fur muff, his eyes darting frantically toward the high limestone cliffs that ringed the quarry like the walls of a fortress. I stood up from the shadows of the kiln, slinging the canvas sea bag over my shoulder, my straight posture a stark contrast to their twitching, anxious movements as Vance advanced to within 10 paces of the water's edge. He called out my name, his cultured, arrogant voice echoing off the limestone walls, telling me that the games of the harbor were at an end and that I had nowhere left to run in a colony where his word was holy law. He gestured to the coaches, and a dozen high sheriff officers in blue colonial uniforms stepped into the lantern light, their heavy muskets and short-barreled carbines leveled straight at my chest. I didn't flinch, didn't reach for the pistol hidden in my waistband. I simply raised the heavy iron lockbox with one hand, balancing it over the deep black water of the pond, where the bottom was nothing but 15 fathoms of shifting silt. I shouted back through the wind, telling him that if a single flint was clicked or a single trigger pulled, the original documents, the ledgers of their decade-long treason, would plunge into the abyss, never to be recovered by his divers. I revealed to him that the full transcripts had already been placed in the hands of a midnight rider 3 hours ago, bound straight for the governor's council in New York, completely out of reach of the local magistrates he had spent a lifetime by. Vance's face froze, the aristocratic composure melting away to reveal the raw, desperate terror of an old man who realized the high gallows he had built for others was suddenly casting a shadow over his own neck. Silas began to whimper, clutching at Vance's red sleeve, whispering that I wasn't bluffing, that I had already reduced their eastern warehouses to smoking cinders and broken their best enforcers with my bare hands. The tension in the quarry was so thick the air felt heavy under the tongue, the sheriff's men shifting nervously on the wet shale, their boots slipping as they looked from the deep water to the unwavering eyes of the woman they had labeled a ghost. Vance raised his gold cane, his voice shaking with a desperate, sudden shift in tone as he offered to grant me a full royal pardon, 3,000 gold pieces, and a safe passage on a swift merchant brig bound for the West Indies if I would just hand over the iron box. I looked at the polished silver buckles on his shoes, then up at his pale, sweating face, and told him his gold couldn't buy back the winter my father died in a cold stone cell, or the nameless ditch where they threw my mother like common carrion. As Silas attempted to sneak around the far side of the pond to take me from the flank, I reached into my coat and pulled out a heavy brass signaling rocket, striking the flint directly against the iron casing before anyone could react. The blinding crimson flare screamed out of the tube, striking the exposed wooden timbers of a nearby abandoned black powder wagon that had been parked next to an old tar vat since the war. The explosion tore through the silence of the canyon, a massive geyser of orange fire and black smoke erupting into the night sky, lighting up the entire quarry as the blast wave shattered the windows of the coaches and threw Silas head first into the mud. Before the echoes could die down, the high rim of the quarry was suddenly flooded by the brilliant, piercing glare of 100 torches carried by the governor's personal regiment, their silver breastplates gleaming as their drums rolled out a steady, terrifying rhythm from the cliffs above. The local officers instantly dropped their muskets into the dirt, realizing that the network of corruption that had protected them for 10 years had just been utterly incinerated by a single, calculated strike. Vance fell to his knees in the slush, his fine robes soaking up the filth of the pit, while I stepped out from the smoke, looking down at the broken ruins of the empire that had tried to bury me. The roaring fires from the shattered powder wagon cast long, dancing crimson shadows across the high limestone walls of the quarry, illuminating the final, absolute collapse of the criminal syndicate that had held Boston by the throat for a generation. Chief Justice Vance lay face down in the freezing slush, his elegant scarlet robes soaking up the black mud and horse filth of the pit. His powdered wig half submerged in a puddle of dirty water as two royal guardsmen from the governor's regiment pinned his arms behind his back with cold steel irons. Silas Vance was sobbing hysterically just a few feet away, his fine beaver fur muff discarded in the dirt as he frantically babbled a full confession to a military colonel, desperately trying to trade every secret he possessed to save his own neck from the high gallows. The dozens of corrupt local officers who had served as their personal army stood in a silent, miserable line, their weapons piled in a humiliating heap on the wet shale, while the torches of the High Regiment ringed the entire canyon like an inescapable wall of fire. I stood perfectly still on a rocky ledge, the heavy canvas sea bag draped securely over my shoulder, watching the entire scene with an absolute dead calm that ran deeper than the frozen earth beneath my boots. There was no surge of wild joy in my chest, no loud cry of triumph, only the profound relief of a soldier who had walked directly into the jaws of hell, broken the beast's teeth, and finally stepped out into the clean air of dawn. The governor's colonel marched down the muddy slope, stopping right before me to take the iron-bound lockbox from my hands, bowing his head in a deep gesture of respect as he promised that the documents will be presented before the Grand Council by tomorrow noon, ensuring every judge, magistrate, and clerk named within those pages would face the full, unyielding weight of the king's justice. I didn't say a word in response, didn't ask for a reward or a seat in their fine carriages, just gave a single, slow nod before turning my back on the ruins of my enemies and walking up the steep, rocky path out of the quarry. As I reached the high ridge, the great storm finally broke, the heavy sleet and suffocating fog rolling back toward the Atlantic to reveal the first thin, beautiful line of a pale golden dawn creeping over the rooftops of Boston. I walked into the city streets as the working folk were just beginning to open their wooden shutters, the honest shipwrights, blacksmiths, and weavers stepping out onto their porches to look up at a sky that finally felt clear of the suffocating weight of fear that had choked them for 10 long years. They looked at my ragged coat, my scarred hands, and my straight, unyielding posture as I passed them, and though they didn't know my name or the war I had just finished fighting in the dark, they could feel the sudden, incredible shift in the wind. I made my way to the old cemetery on the hill, where the grass was overgrown with wild briars and the simple wooden markers had been weathered gray by the salt air, and walked until I found a quiet, unmarked mound of earth where they had buried my mother while I was locked away in chains. I knelt down in the damp grass, my calloused fingers gently clearing away the dead leaves and frozen twigs from the soil, and laid a pair of bright red winter berries right onto the center of the earth, whispering into the quiet air that the debt had been paid in full, the balance had been restored, and that nobody would ever trample our name into the dirt again. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my sea bag one last time, and looked out over the sprawling harbor below, where the white sails of merchant ships were catching the morning light, their flags snapping proudly in a breeze that carried no more smell of corruption or fear. The empire of the rats had been completely demolished, their gold chains turned into shackles, and their fine mansions destined to be auctioned off to heal the very people they had bled dry. I walked down the hill toward the shipping docks, my steps light, my mind perfectly clear, and my soul finally at peace, knowing that I had survived the darkest dungeon just to write a final, permanent chapter of justice on the stone of a new world.